In the heart of Mississippi, back in 1849, where fields of cotton seemed endless, stretching further than a free man's hopes, and the Mississippi River carried more sorrow than water, there is a story that the official history books were too afraid to write down. The Blackwood Manor, a grand house with its tall white columns and sweet-smelling gardens, was the setting for what the newspapers at the time called an unexplainable family tragedy. It was the story of a wedding feast that turned into a mass funeral. In a single night in January, 17 members of Verdant County's most powerful families died a slow and painful death. The looks on their faces were twisted into expressions of agony that doctors could never figure out. What they didn't know and would never understand was that the answer was held in the skilled hands of a woman who had lost everything she ever loved. But in that loss, had found something far more powerful: the patience to serve justice on the most beautiful plate high society had ever seen. This is the story of Alara, a cook who turned simple spices into instruments of revenge and her recipes into death sentences. A woman who chose her own last name when she decided she would no longer be anyone's property. Before we go any further, we'd love to know where you're watching from, and if this is your first time here. Let us know in the comments below, because seeing our community grow from all over the world really helps the channel. And if you're new here, make sure you subscribe to Archive of Fear for more chilling stories that history tried to bury. The Blackwood Plantation was a massive estate, covering over 2,000 acres along the muddy banks of the Mississippi. Its endless rows of cotton plants swayed in the breeze, looking like a white sea under the blistering sun of the summer of 1848. It was one of the most successful properties in Verdant County, known not just for its profitable harvest, but for the luxury of its main house, and, most importantly, for the incredible food served at its table. Colonel Alistair Blackwood had inherited the plantation from his father and made it even bigger using the same cold and deliberate cruelty that was common among men of his status. He was a tall, rail-thin man with cold, icy eyes, and he ruled over his 340 slaves with an iron fist, though he often hid it in a velvet glove. He believed that strict discipline, mixed with a few small rewards, kept order better than constant violence. But the true prize of his plantation wasn't the cotton. It was his reputation for hosting amazing dinners which drew visitors from all over the state. Politicians from the capital, merchants traveling the Mississippi, and other wealthy planters made sure they never turned down an invitation to a Blackwood dinner. The secret to this fame was in the hands of a woman most guests never even saw, but whose talent they all tasted. Alara had come to the plantation as a little girl, in 1829. She was part of a group of slaves bought from a failed estate in South Carolina. She was only 8 years old then, with big, curious eyes and an incredible memory for smells and flavors. The head cook at the time, an old woman named Mama B, quickly saw the girl's natural talent and took her under her wing. For 16 years, Alara learned more than just how to cook. She learned to understand the secrets of spices, the science of how things ferment, and the mysteries of the wild herbs that grew in the nearby swamps. Mama B, who was born in Africa and brought to America as a girl, held the ancient knowledge of medicinal plants. She taught Alara that every leaf, every root, and every seed had a purpose. Some were meant to heal. Others were meant to bring sleep. And some had purposes it was better not to speak of out loud. Our people knew the secrets of the earth long before the ships came, Mama Bear would whisper as they dried herbs by moonlight. Long before the chains. This knowledge is in our blood, passed from mother to daughter. It's an inheritance they can never steal. Mama B also taught Alara something just as precious: how to read and write. During the long winter nights when the kitchen was quiet, she showed the young girl how to trace letters in the dirt, how to read the words in the fancy recipe books from the main house, and how to keep a secret journal of her own discoveries about plants. The old woman always said, "Knowledge is the one thing they can never take from you. If you can read, you can learn anything. If you can write, you can leave your mark on this world, even when they pretend you're invisible." When Mama Bay died from a fever in 1845, Alara, then 24, naturally took her place as the head cook. By then, she had married a blacksmith named Elias and had given birth to 3 beautiful children: Leo, born in 1841, Clara, born in 1842, and little Samuel, born in 1844. Their family lived in a cabin that was a little bigger than the others, a small privilege granted because of how important Elara was to the plantation's reputation. Colonel Blackwood rarely spoke to Elara directly. He gave his orders through his wife, Eleanor, a frail and anxious woman who spent her days doing needlepoint and taking medicine for her nervous conditions. It was Eleanor who planned the menus for special events, always using an old recipe book that belonged to her mother-in-law. But it was Elara who took those simple instructions and turned them into masterpieces. The kitchen of the main house was Elara's kingdom. It was a large room with a huge iron stove, shelves filled with exotic spices brought in by riverboats, and a pantry as well stocked as any city hotel. She led a team of 6 young women whom she had trained herself. Each had a special job. Sarah baked the breads and desserts. Hannah handled the meats. Grace was in charge of making jams and pickles. But Elara kept the most important secrets for herself. She was the one who mixed the special sauces that made guests moan with delight. She was the one who knew the perfect amount of time to smoke a ham, and she knew the exact blend of herbs to turn a simple soup into something unforgettable. Elara's children lived in the slave quarters with the other kids, but they would sometimes come to the kitchen when she needed to keep an eye on them. By 1848, 7-year-old Leo was already eager to learn his father's work at the forge. 6-year-old Clara had her mother's curiosity for plants and would often help her gather herbs. And 4-year-old Samuel was happy to play with the little dolls made of corn husks that Elara made for him in her few moments of free time. Life on the plantation had a steady rhythm. Within the cruel limits of slavery, Elara's life was as stable as it could be. She had found a way to shield her family by making herself essential. The colonel would never sell the cook who secured his social standing, and because of that, he would never separate her from her family. It was a fragile illusion of safety, one she held onto tightly, not realizing that for a slave, stability was always a mirage, easily shattered by the whims of those who held absolute power. Marcus Blackwood, the colonel's eldest son, had just come back from his studies in Natchez. At 22, he was a younger, crueler copy of his father. He had the same cold eyes, but none of the self-control that came with age and duty. During his time away, he had developed a taste for amusements that involved hurting those who couldn't fight back. Elara had noticed the way Marcus looked at her young kitchen assistants and how he made excuses to come to the kitchen when his father was away. She started making sure the girls were always busy and directly under her watch whenever he came around. But she couldn't be everywhere at once, and Marcus had nothing but time. What Elara didn't know was that Marcus had also noticed her children on their visits to the kitchen. In his twisted mind, he saw them as a new way to entertain himself. After all, they were just games, and slave children, he thought, needed to learn their place in the world early. On hot summer afternoons, Marcus would wander around the plantation looking for something to do. He took a special interest in educating the slave children on their place in the world, creating cruel games that he called valuable lessons. Elara could feel the tension rise in the quarters whenever Marcus showed up. Mothers would pull their children closer. Men would look down at the ground and work harder. But she never imagined that her own children would soon become the target of the young master's sadistic games. The Blackwood plantation was a little kingdom of its own, with unwritten rules and a strict hierarchy. At the very top was the colonel and his family, then the white overseers, and at the bottom, the slaves. Elara had learned to move through this system with caution, using her special position as cook to keep her family safe. But she was about to learn a terrible lesson. That protection was an illusion that could be destroyed in a single moment of casual cruelty. The autumn of 1848 arrived with a deceptive beauty, painting the oak leaves gold and filling the air with the scent of harvest. It was Elara's favorite time of year, when the kitchen work grew more intense with preparations for winter, and the dinners became more grand. One October morning, Elara woke before the sun, as always. The air was cool, and a light fog hung over the fields. She started the fire in the kitchen stove and began making breakfast for the main house, her hands moving with the easy rhythm of years of practice. Her husband Elias was already at the forge, and her children were still sleeping in their cabin. Today was a special day. The colonel was hosting a lunch for a group of neighboring planters. It was the kind of event that required Alara's absolute best, a meal designed to impress powerful men and prove that the Blackwood plantation was a place of wealth and success. Alara had planned the menu down to the last detail: turtle soup, roasted duck with a wild berry sauce, honey-glazed ham, and for dessert, her legendary bourbon pudding. As she directed her assistants, Alara felt a quiet moment of pride. Her work had brought fame to the plantation, and that fame, she believed, kept her family safe. It was a delicate balance, but one she had managed to hold for years. Around 10 in the morning, Leo, Clara, and Samuel came to the kitchen. Alara gave them some leftover sweetbread and told them to play in the small yard just outside, where she could see them. She laid down the rules, as she always did. "Stay where I can see you, Leo. You watch your brother and sister, and Samuel, don't you wander off." Leo, with the seriousness of a little man, nodded and took charge of his siblings. Alara watched them for a moment, their laughter floating on the morning air, and allowed herself to dream. Maybe Leo could learn to read and write like she had. Maybe Clara could use her love of plants for more than just survival. Maybe little Samuel could grow up in a world where he wasn't someone's property. They were dangerous dreams, she knew, but they were all she had. The lunch was a huge success. From the kitchen, she could hear the guests praising each dish. The colonel was pleased, and his wife Eleanor even sent a message of congratulations. It was almost 3 in the afternoon when Alara realized she hadn't seen her children in a while. A small knot of worry tightened in her stomach, but she told herself they were probably playing in the quarters. It was Hannah who brought the terrible news. She had gone to fetch firewood from near the quarters and saw smoke pouring out of the old, abandoned barn at the edge of the fields. Hannah burst into the kitchen out of breath. "Fire!" she gasped. "The old barn is on fire." Alara's heart stopped. The old barn. That's where the children sometimes played. Without a second thought, she dropped the spoon she was holding and sprinted out the door, shouting for Sarah to watch the kitchen. The smoke was a thick, black column against the bright blue sky. Alara ran faster than she had ever run in her life, her heart pounding in her ears. Other slaves were running too, carrying buckets of water. When she reached the barn, it was already swallowed by flames. The heat was unbearable, and the smoke choked the air. But it was the sound that broke her. Faint, muffled screams coming from inside the burning building. Voices she knew instantly. "My children! My babies are in there!" she shrieked, trying to run into the fire. Strong arms grabbed her, holding her back. It was her husband, Elias, his face streaked with soot and terror. "You'll die," he yelled, struggling to hold her as she fought against him. Other men tried to get to the door, but the flames were too fierce. The old dry wood of the barn burned like paper, and the roof was starting to cave in. The screams from inside grew weaker, then stopped. Alara went limp in her husband's arms and collapsed to the ground. A sound tore from her throat that wasn't human. It was the sound of a soul shattering. It took 2 hours to put the fire out. When they could finally go inside, they found the 3 small bodies huddled together in a corner. Leo had tried to shield his younger siblings with his own body. It hadn't been enough. Later, they discovered the truth. The barn door had been bolted shut from the outside. Someone had locked her children inside before setting it on fire. But who and why? Marcus Blackwood showed up an hour later, claiming he'd been out riding and had only just seen the smoke. He offered his condolences to his father for the loss of valuable property and suggested it was just an accident. Children playing with fire, perhaps. But 3 days later, Grace, one of the young kitchen assistants, came to Alara in secret. Her voice was barely a whisper as she told Alara what she had seen that day. She had seen Marcus near the barn, playing with the children. She heard him laughing and telling them he had a new game. He told them to go inside the barn and wait, that he was going to get a surprise for them. Alara said nothing. She just nodded and went back to peeling potatoes. But in that moment, something inside her died forever, and something new and terrifying was born in its place. That night, alone in her now silent cabin, Alara made a vow. She would no longer be just Alara, the cook. From that day forward, she would be Alara Freeman. She chose the name for herself, a name that meant she was free, and she would fight for her own kind of freedom. Not the freedom of running away, but the freedom that comes with justice. The freedom that would only be hers when the people who took everything from her paid the ultimate price. Alara Freeman began to plan. In the days that followed, she went about her duties as if nothing had changed. But at night, she would slip out of her cabin and walk to the charred ruins of the barn. There she knelt on the blackened earth and made promises to her lost children, whispering their names. Leo, Clara, and Samuel, into the darkness. She promised she would not forget. She promised she would make them all pay. And on the darkest, moonless nights, she began to gather the plants Mama Bea had taught her about. Plants that grew in the shadows, plants that held the deadliest secrets of nature. The months after her children's deaths changed Alara in ways no one on the Blackwood plantation could see. On the outside, she was the same efficient, brilliant cook, but inside, she had become a different person. Her husband, Elias, was the first to feel the change. She grew silent, but it wasn't the silence of grief, it was the silence of calculation. She would sit by the window for hours at night, staring at the main house with an unreadable expression. When he spoke of the future, of maybe having more children one day, she looked at him as if he were speaking another language. For Alara, there was no future. There was only the task at hand. In the kitchen, she made small changes. She now insisted on preparing every dish for the Blackwood family herself, allowing no one to touch the food after she added the final seasonings. She claimed it was for quality control. But Hannah noticed she had started keeping certain herbs and spices in a small, locked box. When asked about them, Alara would just say they were special ingredients for special occasions. What no one knew was that Alara was making secret trips into the swamps at night. Using the knowledge from Mama Bee, she gathered plants that only grew in certain places. Mushrooms that sprouted from rotting logs, vines that choked dead trees, roots that could only be found in the dead of winter. Mama Bea had warned her about these plants. Some were for healing, she had said, but others were for when healing was no longer an option, for when only justice remained. Alara now understood what the old woman meant. Over the winter of 1848, she began to experiment. She started with tiny, undetectable doses in Marcus Blackwood's food. Not enough to kill him, not yet, just enough to make him sick. Unexplained stomach cramps, waves of nausea, sleepless nights followed by days of crushing fatigue. Marcus started complaining constantly about his health. Doctors from Vicksburg and Natchez could find nothing wrong with him. They suggested it was stress or told him to avoid spicy food. Alara almost smiled when she heard that. If only they knew. All the while, she watched. She learned the family's routines, their meal times, and what foods each of them liked best. She learned that the Colonel loved rich, dark sauces, that his wife Eleanor preferred light, sweet dishes, and that Marcus liked his meat rare and heavily seasoned. And most importantly, she learned that a big event was being planned for early 1849. Catherine, the Colonel's youngest daughter, was engaged to be married to Edward Davenport, the son of another wealthy planter family. The wedding was set for the end of January, and it was going to be the biggest social event of the season. Eleanor started planning months ahead, consulting Alara daily on the menu for the wedding feast. It would be an intimate affair, just for the immediate families and a few close relatives. It was a chance for the Blackwood family to show off, and their reputation was on the line. During one of their meetings, Eleanor stressed that the wedding had to be perfect. "It will be a day our families will remember forever," she said. "It will be perfect," Alara promised, and she meant it. Perfectly planned, perfectly executed, and perfectly final. During the long winter nights, Alara refined her master plan. She wouldn't just poison the food. That was too simple. She wanted her revenge to be a work of art. She wanted every person at that table to get exactly what they deserved. Through conversations she overheard and preparations she watched, she built a mental list of everyone who would be there. The entire Blackwood family, the Colonel, Eleanor, Marcus, Catherine, and their younger brother Charles. The Davenport family, Edward's parents, his two brothers and his sister, a few aunts, uncles, and cousins, 17 people in total. 17 people who had lived their lives benefiting from the system that had murdered her children. 17 people who had never once questioned their right to own other human beings. For each name, she planned a specific fate. Colonel Blackwood, who had allowed his son's crime to be covered up, would receive the main course, literally. Marcus, the murderer, would suffer a slower, more agonizing death. Eleanor, who had lived a life of comfort built on the suffering of others, would die confused and terrified. And the rest of them would learn a final, brutal lesson about the true cost of their comfortable lives. Alara spent the rest of the winter perfecting her recipes, not just the ones for cooking, but the others, the ones she learned from Mama Bear and from her own dark experiments. A crucial discovery was a way to protect the innocent. There would be a few young children at the wedding. For them, she would prepare separate dishes, sweet, warm porridge and milk that would make them fall into a deep, peaceful sleep. Alara's justice was precise. It was meant only for the guilty. By the time spring of 1849 arrived, Alara Freeman was ready. She was no longer a grieving cook. She was an avenging angel with a plan, the knowledge to carry it out, and most importantly, nothing left to lose. The morning of January 27th, 1849, was crisp and cold. A thin layer of frost coated the fields like powdered sugar. It was Catherine Blackwood's wedding day, and the plantation was alive with activity. Alara had been awake since 3 in the morning, not with nerves, but with the cold calm of a soldier before a battle. The kitchen was an organized chaos of bubbling pots and roaring ovens. Her assistants moved around her in a practiced dance, but Alara kept control over the most important things: the sauces, the seasonings, and the final touches on every plate. The menu was a masterpiece of Southern cuisine, designed to make the guests remember this feast for the rest of their lives. Which, as Alara knew, wouldn't be very long. The guests began to arrive around noon. Alara watched them from the kitchen window, recognizing the faces she had studied for months. There was the patriarch of the Davenport family, a man known for his brutality. Beside him, his wife, who was famous for selling off slave families to keep them from forming bonds. Their 2 cruel sons and their arrogant young daughter. 17 guests in total, each one carrying their own share of guilt. The wedding took place in the garden. Catherine looked beautiful in her dress, and Edward looked nervous. From the kitchen window, Alara watched the celebration of life and love, knowing what was about to happen. She felt no regret, only a cold, hard satisfaction. When the ceremony was over, the guests moved to the dining room. The table was set with the family's finest silver and crystal, glittering in the candlelight. Before the main feast, Alara personally served the 3 children who were present. She gave them sweet porridge and warm, vanilla-flavored milk. Soon, they began to yawn, and their mothers put them to bed upstairs, thinking they were just tired from the day's excitement. Alara had calculated it perfectly. The children would sleep soundly through the horror to come. The first course was served. The guests loved the oysters and the turtle soup. Colonel Blackwood even made a toast to his cook's incredible skill, and the room erupted in applause. Watching from the kitchen doorway, Alara allowed herself a small, cold smile. She had added just a tiny trace of her special ingredients to the soup, just enough to prepare their bodies for what was next. It was during the main course that her plan truly unfolded. Alara had assigned a specific poison to each guest. For the brutal Colonel Davenport, a poison that would cause slow, agonizing convulsions. For his wife, who tore families apart, a toxin that would make her see terrifying hallucinations of the people she had wronged. For the cruel Davenport sons, a substance that would attack their nervous systems, paralyzing them slowly so they could feel their bodies failing them. And for Marcus, she had saved her masterpiece, a combination of 3 different toxins that would activate at different times. First, excruciating pain. Then, a loss of all muscle control. And finally, a complete paralysis that would leave him fully conscious but unable to move or speak as his body shut down around him. The banquet continued for nearly 2 hours. The guests ate and drank, laughing and celebrating. The room was filled with toasts, speeches, and cheerful conversation. Then, around 9 o'clock, the first signs appeared. Colonel Davenport was the first to fall. He was in the middle of a speech when he suddenly went pale and clutched his stomach. His wife turned to ask what was wrong, but before he could answer, she began choking. Within minutes, the elegant dining room descended into chaos. Guests cried out, clutching their throats and chests. Some staggered towards the door, desperate for air, while others collapsed onto the table, their bodies convulsing in pain. The sounds of laughter were replaced by moans of agony and screams of pure terror. Marcus Blackwood tried to stand, but his legs wouldn't move. He looked down in confusion, not understanding why his body had betrayed him. Then, his eyes locked with Alara's. She was standing in the kitchen doorway, watching the result of her work. In that single, silent moment, he understood. Terror filled his eyes as the realization hit him. But it was too late. His mouth opened to scream, but no sound came out. Alara watched him for a few seconds longer, her face a mask of cold composure. Then she calmly turned and walked back into the kitchen. She had dishes to wash, evidence to burn, and an escape to make. But first, she had one last thing to do. From her apron, she took a small piece of paper. On it, she had written a message in her neatest handwriting. She placed it on the kitchen table where it couldn't be missed, and then she slipped out the back door and disappeared into the night. The note said simply, "For Leo, Clara, and Samuel. Justice has been served. Alara Freeman." When neighbors and the local sheriff arrived the next morning, they found a scene of unimaginable horror. 17 bodies were strewn across the dining room, their faces frozen in expressions of agony. There were no adult survivors. The 3 children were found upstairs, sleeping peacefully, unharmed, and Alara Freeman was gone. The discovery of the massacre at the Blackwood plantation sent a shockwave of fear across the entire South. The story of the Blackwood wedding massacre filled the newspapers. The Warren County Sheriff, a man named Brody, later said the scene was like something out of a nightmare. The investigation quickly pointed to poisoning, but the doctors were baffled. Each victim seemed to have died from something different, as if they had each been targeted personally. Then they found the note in the kitchen. "For Leo, Clara, and Samuel. Justice has been served. Alara Freeman." It was both a confession and a terrifying declaration of war. Colonel Blackwood, who had been away on business, returned to find his family destroyed. When they showed him the note, he knew exactly who Leo, Clara, and Samuel were. He finally understood the terrible price of his son's cruelty and his own silence. A massive manhunt for Alara Freeman began. A reward of $500 was offered for her capture, dead or alive. But Alara had vanished. Some said she was seen heading north. Others swore she got on a riverboat. The truth was she had planned her escape as carefully as she had planned the massacre. She had spent months hiding food and supplies along a secret route through the swamps, following trails only runaway slaves knew. Her husband Elias was questioned, but he truly knew nothing of her plans. When the sheriff showed him the note, he wept, a mixture of pride, terror, and heartbreak. "She was always stronger than any of us knew," he admitted. The massacre had a lasting impact. Wealthy planters across the South began to eye their own slaves with suspicion, especially their cooks. The era of grand, trusting dinners was over. For the first time, the slave-owning elite was forced to face the truth. Their slaves were not mindless property. They were human beings with memories, emotions, and the capacity for vengeance. Alara Freeman had shattered the illusion that their power was absolute. Over the years, there were scattered, unconfirmed sightings of Alara. In Tennessee, in Ohio, even in Canada. Her final fate remains a mystery, and perhaps that's for the best. Her true victory wasn't just escaping. It was proving that justice has many faces, and sometimes it is served on a fine china plate. The Blackwood plantation fell into ruin, haunted by the memory of that night. It was eventually sold and torn down. Alara's name, however, lived on. In the slave quarters, it was whispered with awe. She had become a legend, a symbol of resistance, a ghost story that was terrifyingly real. Celia Freeman wasn't just a story of revenge. It was a story of a woman who refused to let her pain be ignored, who proved that even in the darkest of times, the powerless can find a way to claim their own justice. Her story forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. Was it revenge or was it justice? History doesn't give us easy answers. But it gives us Alara Freeman, a woman who decided that some sins are too great to be forgiven and some memories are too powerful to be forgotten. If this story from the Archive of Fear resonated with you, share it with someone who needs to know that even in history's darkest corners, there were always those who refused to suffer in silence. Give this video a like to help us unearth more forgotten stories, and let us know in the comments. Do you think Alara found peace in the end? Subscribe now for more chapters from the hidden archives of history.